A season that kicked off with big signings, over 100 million spent, star players scoring goals, came to a grinding halt against Inter. There are now questions around players, the coach, the ownership, but at this point in time, Milan are forced to move on with their opening Champions League match, which happens to be against the one guy who funded Milan's entire mercato. A game that'll see the return of Sandro Tonali to the San Siro and sees Milan take on Premier League side Newcastle United. Now, it's been a while since I've done a match preview, so we're gonna go through our lineup, the team sheet, to see who starts and who sits on the bench in the first match of what everybody's calling the group of death. And you might be surprised to see who I'll be putting on as my right winger. Starting up from our backline, obvious one, Mike starts in goal. Now, because of time in the previous video, I didn't put my take on Mike's performance against Inter. I don't know, you guys let me know in the comment section, when your team gives up 5 goals, do you think a certain amount of criticism has to fall on the goalkeeper as well? Now, when you look at those goals individually, maybe you could say that, yeah, it was a little bit tough for him to make those saves, but you'd hope he'd do better against Thuram's shot. And the second thing is, you kind of look at his build-up play. That's Mainio's asset. But in this case, I think it was the second or maybe the third goal when it became 3-1. It was a Mike Maignan launched ball outside that didn't fall to the right party, fell to Inter, they came back, countered, and they got that third strike. So conceding 5 goals, not being exactly available in the build-up play, I don't think it was the best performance from Mike, but obviously against Newcastle, the player gets a start. The starting right back for Milan, I think this one is a somewhat obvious one. I'm not quite sure if Kalulu is going to be back from his injury. I don't know if Florenzi necessarily gets a start. So I think naturally, the captain of the team, I don't think Pioli's going to be ruffling too many feathers by dropping the captain for the first Champions League match of the season. I think Davide Calabria starts, but trust me guys, I'm reading your comments. I understand that a lot of people have doubts about this player's capabilities on the right flank, and I think some of those doubts are fair. I think there was a time, maybe about a season and a half ago, or even at certain points in last season, when Davide would make those runs and whip those balls in. And in the back line, as a defensive player, as a more defensive-minded right back, he was fairly reliable on that flank. But as of late, something just isn't very convincing about our captain. Keep in mind, Paolo Maldini is the greatest winger in the game that I've ever seen, and he brought on Diogo Dalot for a reason. I think there were doubts in Milan's management about the capability of Davide Calabria, and I think some of those doubts will probably still remain and be justified. But for the match against Newcastle, we'll probably see him start and possibly see Florenzi make an appearance too. The 2 center backs for tomorrow's match, this one's going to be a relatively obvious one. It has to be Fikayo Tomori and Malik Tau alongside him. But I think to me, the way that Inter were playing is very different from how Newcastle will play. Because looking at Newcastle, they kicked off their season pretty well, had a convincing win in the opening match. Sandro Tonali opened their season with a goal. It was pretty much a perfect day for the team, kind of piggybacking on a solid season that they had last time around. So it started off bright. Their second match was away to Manchester City. Okay, fine. They lost that 1-0 against the team that won the treble last season. You can kind of walk away from that explaining it away. But I think it's the third match of the season when things went horribly wrong for them. Being up 1-0, seeing Virgil van Dijk get that red card. Now you have a man advantage. You're up 1-0 and you have an hour to play in the game. You should really be going for the kill. And instead, I think around that 85th minute mark, they end up conceding a goal, and a few minutes later, a second goal, and they end up losing 2-1 at home when they were up 1-0 with a man advantage for an hour. But I think it was a loss against Brighton that completely derailed their campaign. Now, you can justify a loss against Man City. You can say that, okay, Liverpool has always had their number in St. James Park, but then going away to Brighton and getting outplayed the way that they did, that certainly threw off their campaign because it was a third loss in a row. To me, that shows a degree of inexperience within the team and possibly even with the coaching side. And I think that inexperience is probably what Milan is going to look to capitalize on. At the end of the day, Newcastle hasn't played in the Champions League in over 20 years, and Milan on the other side made the semifinals last time around. So I think the experience that these players bring in is what Pioli is going to be banking on. And I think the 2 pieces that will help Milan a lot would be Fikayo Tomori and Malik Tau. And Fikayo Tomori coming off a suspension. So Tomori at this point in time will almost have a 3-week break. And Malik Tau against Inter, a lot of you guys in the comment section told me after my match review for that game, why didn't I give him a red box or call him out? Quite honestly, guys, for me, it just felt like this is a highly inexperienced guy. I don't even know if he has 50 professional appearances at the top level. And he's a player who's only 22 years old. I think it's a little bit unfair on Milan to demand that that's the player that carries the entire backline. That too in a massive derby match where your coach is actually getting all the tactics wrong. If after spending over 100 million and having a Serie A winning coach on your team, your last resort of hope to not concede goals is Malik Tau, I think you're in big trouble anyways. So I felt like I wanted to call out the players that have more experience and we expect more from. But for the match against Newcastle, Demori and Malik Tau, easy picks. Starting on the left flank, this one's going to be a very easy pick. I mean, it's not even like we have very solid backups for Theo Hernandez anyways. I mean, at least for Calabria, we have Florenzi, we have Kalulu. For Theo, we really essentially have nobody who's an out-and-out left back who can start in a Champions League match. And really, when you're playing a Premier League side like Newcastle, you know that there's going to be pace in that game, and you're going to have to rely on somebody like Theo Hernandez, who is that fast-paced player, to be able to manage against a side like Newcastle. The three-man midfield, again, this one's a pretty obvious one. You're holding midfield on, unfortunately, without any other options. It has to be Rade Krunic. His performance against Inter, the whole team sucked at the end of the day. Pretty questionable against Inter, but I don't think he was the worst player on that team. And really at the core of it, in the absence of any options, the management not recognizing the importance of signing a central defensive midfielder, we have to play Krunic there. There's some reports that Pioli might make a change to the midfield. He might start one of Yunus Musa or Tommaso Pobega and rest one of these three guys. For me, I don't think there's much of a chance that Krunic is the one that gets rested. I think it's more likely that one of Reinders or Loftus-Cheek gets rested, because really in the past multiple matches that we've seen, they're actually the ones who are making more of the runs. They're playing that number 8 role, just moving around all over the field, especially Tani Reinders. Krunic, on the other hand, is mostly just sitting back and eating up the pressure and trying to, at times, dictate the play. But I think of all the players in our midfield, he's probably the one that has his cardio tested the least. So if it's a technical or a tactical change, I guess it could be anyone. But if it's for rest, it's probably going to be one of Loftus-Cheek or Reinders. But for me, in my starting 11, there's no doubt about the fact that I would start with Ruben Loftus-Cheek. The guy has a serious amount of Premier League experience. Really, he only has Premier League experience. And the other player that I would start alongside Krunic, I'll remain and maintain the status quo, it would be Tiani Reinders. I'm probably a little bit more curious to see how Yunus Musa plays. I have a better understanding of how Pobega plays. I think it was the match against Roma where Pobega actually looked pretty good. But when you're playing your opening Champions League match, I feel like Milan should probably stick with their best 11 and make substitutions at the right time instead of experimenting too much, not having that cohesion in your unit, and dropping points in your opening freaking match. And in the front line, starting on the right wing, this might surprise some people. I would actually start with Christian Pulisic. I think the player has, as I said with the Ruben Loftus-Cheek, serious amount of Premier League experience. They're used to playing at a certain type of tempo that teams like Newcastle like to play on. I think for me, when players have a certain degree of familiarity with their opponent, their confidence level is a little bit different too. And coming off the back of a 5-1 loss, I think you want players who are raring to prove themselves and also have had the past experience of playing this style of football that Premier League teams like to play. So for me, I would give Christian Pulisic that start. I do have my doubts that actually going to happen. I think it's going to be Samuel Chukwueze who starts, mostly because I think Pulisic is just tired at this point, which makes it an important audition for this player as well. With the arrival of Pulisic, with the early goals that the guy has scored, one of the most talked about signings from Milan summer mercato and Samuel Chukwueze is kind of taking the back seat. And now with a couple of slowed down performances by the American captain, I think it's time for the Nigerian to actually look at that and say, this is my opportunity. If I can perform well against Newcastle, if I can get on the score sheet or get an assist, it's going to definitely help me once again be level with Pulisic, and then we're going to be fighting once again for that right wing spot, and it won't be a foregone conclusion that Christian's the one who's going to be starting. So for me, that player on the right flank, Pulisic. For Pioli, probably Chukwueze. Again, this is a pretty easy one. It has to be Rafael Leao. As we've talked about Leao in the past, one of the reasons why he didn't get that Ballon d'Or nomination is probably because the big game matches, at least the matches that have the most eyes on them, in that match against Chelsea or Spurs, or then naturally in that semi-final against Inter, Leao was relatively absent. So in a match against Newcastle, if Leao can put in a performance of a goal and an assist, I think that will raise his stake dramatically. And these are the kind of big matches that he should be raring to get in and actually carry that number 10 that he now wears. So for the match against Newcastle, easy pick on the left flank, it's Rafael Leao. And up front, to close things off, the guy has scored, 4 goals in the opening 3 matches? 3 of those have come from penalties, but it still increases your confidence. And at the same time, this is the sad part, in the Milan derby, the only player that actually didn't really do much wrong and looked like probably our best player in attack was Olivier Giroud, the 36-year-old Olivier Giroud. So for the match against Newcastle, I don't think it should be an experiment of Jovic or Okafor playing there. I think it has to be a match that started, at least, by Olivier Giroud. At this point in time, the only thing I can say is this. After taking a terrible 5-1 loss, the right kind of result against Newcastle, and more importantly, the right type of performance, a dominant performance against Newcastle on the big stage against a Premier League side in a Champions League match, that can easily bring your somewhat derailed confidence completely back on track. And the good thing about Newcastle United is it's not an easy test, but they're a beatable side for Milan. I think with Newcastle, the team, especially playing at home, will go with that confidence and belief that they can actually beat them. Well, there you have it, Milanisti. That would be my starting lineup for the match against Newcastle United. Not really too many changes here. More like a status quo team that we've been seeing throughout the entirety of the season. And you guys, make sure to let me know in the comment section, what do you think about the lineup? Which players do you agree with? And who would you replace? And once again, if you haven't already, make sure to hit the subscribe button, hit the bell notification so you can watch these videos as soon as I upload them. And as always, Forza Milan, grazie mille e ciao tutti!